This is maybe the podcast that I've been waiting the longest to to get you on here. So, Kate, welcome to Second Nature. I'm so excited for this conversation.
I am so excited as well. It's been a long time coming. Thanks for having me.
The whole thing with Second Nature originally started with Dylan and I having these conversations, and it was just like the conversations we were having on the phone. We just basically recorded them as a podcast, and you and I have had so many incredible phone calls, and we've shared so many different book recommendations and sort of like all these tips along the way to like help each other out. And I think actually like that's the formula that works. Let's talk about books. Let's talk about career advice. Let's just riff on all this stuff and I think this format that I've got in mind here is going to work out pretty well for us.
Authenticity always works, and I've authentically spent a lot of time learning from you and talking to you throughout different phases of my career. So it'll be fun to go through some of that today.
Yeah. I'm really excited. I mean, both of us are voracious readers, and most of the Second Nature community is as well. So, sort of the format we're going to go through, because I know you and most of these books you've recommended to me anyway. I basically try to match up different books with different phases of your career. That way, we could kind of use them as sort of like a framework for kind of what your thought process was going through that phase and sort of these maybe some tactical advice for people that might find themselves in each one of those, because I think we're all in constant states of evolution anyway, and there might be something that someone takes away from the early days of your career that might be useful, but there might also be some of the mindset that you're going through right now and trying to kind of wrap things up. And yeah, I don't know, I think there's a lot that we could kind of dig into here, so I'll do my best to kind of guide us through the library, as it were.
Awesome. And yeah, all our listeners will walk away with some homework too. So
Yeah.
they'll
Yeah.
have a good reading list.
You know what's funny is that there's this one, it's not a book, but something our friend Dre wrote that kind of, I think, tees up this entire thing. And he wrote this thing called Disrupting Your Narrative. It's on Substack. And he actually was the editor for the Red Bulletin. You probably worked with him at some point at Red Bull. But he wrote this article basically talking about how he just uplifted his family and decided to move to Amsterdam and just sort of wanted to figure out life. And one of the things that I took away from that article with him was this idea that so many things that could be life changing for us are sort of just past the line of, "Ah, I could never do that." And so many of these things, your instant gut reaction is going to be, "Ah, I could never do that." And I think one of the things that I find in a lot of these books of like, well, what would have to be true for this actually to work out? Because nothing is impossible. You can do anything if you just get past, oh, I could never do that. And I feel like there's something, if there was any sort of thread through a lot of the stuff that we read and share, it kind of comes down to that. Like, well, of course you could, but what would have to be true for that to happen? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I love that idea, and it's something that I would say is top of mind at this moment. I've obviously had a bit of change this year. I started a new team, which is a lot like starting a new company. And my husband also quit his job in December and just launched a startup with a classmate from Stanford. So we are both in this big moment of kind of impossible task structure. And what I found really interesting, I was actually listening to one of your podcasts on a ride, and was you asked about inspiration, and I really was reflecting on the fact that there's kind of two types for me. There's like this emotional inspiration that makes you excited about the idea, about the big picture. It motivates you to think, oh, that would be so cool. And then there's like practical inspiration that helps you take the first step. It's like the mantra or the advice or the sometimes like more boring piece of wisdom that helps you actually envision what would have to be true to take a step towards that kind of impossible grand vision. And I think my husband and I have between us both of those mindsets. Will's an optimist. He's very inspirational, but he's more practical. He's more structured. He's more kind of cognitive in the way that he conveys inspiration. And I would say I'm a little more pie in the sky girly. I'm the big dreamer, big ideas. And it's been really interesting to see how we can kind of help each other think through the sticking points of doing something really challenging.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting to have you kind of need both ends of the spectrum, right? You have to have the big vision, but then you also have to have the tactics to get there. I mean, what's the thing? A goal without a plan is just a wish, right? So
Absolutely.
how do you make it happen? Like you can have all the ideas in the world, but if you can't get down to the nuts and bolts of making it happen, it's pretty darn tough.
Completely.
Okay, let's start. I
We're
want to
starting.
go all the way back to the beginning. The first book that I picked out for us to kind of frame this whole conversation up is Perennial Seller. So we're going to go through kind of your career, and I think the Perennial Seller kind of lines up pretty well with kind of like your first days as a mountain bike racer. And for those that are listening to the podcast who maybe don't have all the context to who you are, or they don't understand that the jersey behind me here is the world champion mountain bike jersey or any of that kind of stuff, like you are a world champion mountain biker. You've gone all over the world. You've done all kinds of incredible stuff on two wheels, and now you have your own race team that it represents your foundation. And I just want to get that out of the way because we need to set sort of the table stakes here. We're going to talk about your entire career from start to finish and use these books to get there. And so, Perennial Seller, I think, is a really important book. It's by Ryan Holiday, one of our favorite authors collectively here. And I think what's important about Perennial Seller as a book is that it talks a lot about sort of creating enduring work, your positioning, and in this case, your positioning as an athlete, how you show up, and then, of course, building an audience and sustaining success. So when you think about kind of how you got into racing, what did that look like? And from the beginning, was this sort of always the plan? Like, I'm going to be a pro mountain biker.
I think one of the valuable things about being early in your career is that you kind of don't know what you don't know. So for me, when I started mountain biking, I just did it because I loved it. And I think I started initially just going out on adventure rides, spending time on Mount Tam with my dad. And at the time, I had a few other kind of more competitive outlets in sport. But I, I didn't really make the connection that that was something I could pursue mastery in early on. And I would say the kind of first moment that I was introduced to the racing side, I definitely felt something and like kind of that this is it feeling of I just loved doing it. And I loved the challenge of mountain bike racing and I loved how multifaceted that challenge was. So there's technical, there's tactical, there's the physical aspect. And I think actually I was really drawn to the mental aspect of mountain bike racing where you do have time in the race to think and you do have time in training to think and mastering that kind of cognitive side of it was really interesting to me. So I kind of came into sport, I loved it, and I wanted to find out how good I was. And so you kind of go to the local race and, oh, okay, I'm doing pretty well here. What if I went to a national level race? What if I qualified to go with Team USA to a World Cup? Like, there really were those small steps for me. Um, and in terms of like the enduring work piece, to me, what creates enduring work is like authenticity and engagement, like the depth with which you do the thing. And the benefit of those early days was that there was nothing else for me. I was just doing the thing. It was authentically driven, and I was deeply engaged with it. And then it started to accumulate into something that turned into a little bit more of a work and career oriented engagement with mountain biking. But yeah, those early days, it really was just about trying to go as fast and as far as I could.
That's so cool. I feel like so many times we get so wrapped up in sort of the end potential goal of this thing. What's the upside? Why am I doing this? Am I monetizing this? And I got some really good advice from a friend a couple weeks ago, actually. He was like, dude, you're in a garage band that everybody loves. Just keep touring. And
Love that.
I feel like that advice is really handy to have to just kind of put yourself in check a little bit. Like, remember the whole reason why you started this was because you loved doing it and don't let go of that. And I think so many of us, we get so wrapped up in like, well, there is a way to make this go and then this and then this, but really like why are you doing it again? And I think that comes back to your point about authenticity where it's like, no, I'm doing this because I just really love it. I'm all about riding mountain bikes or having conversations on podcasts with people. I would do this anyway if I can have an opportunity that comes from it to go race in World Cups or, whatever, like that sounds great too. But actually, like I'm having fun doing it. And it seems so simple, but it's got to be hard also when the balance of what you had to do in those days too is like training up and skilling up for these events. Like you had to get somewhat serious, I would imagine. And
Yeah, completely. And I would say the serious part has never been a challenge for me. I've always been kind of driven and detail oriented and motivated in that kind of more intense way that I think most endurance athletes are.
Mhm.
But I've been talking a lot with friends about this kind of like focus on the 1% and marginal gains and this rhetoric that's gotten a lot of popular. It's grown in popularity in recent times. And I think when I think of those early days, I think of the 99%. And the 99% was riding my bike, feeling what it felt like to go a little bit faster, feeling what an interval felt like, having these kind of tangible, more qualitative, like big parts of success that you just stack year over year over year. And I think it's really easy as you get better and better and better to over index on the 1%. So, like those tiny little things that might make you a tiny bit better, those are important. And if you want to win a World Cup, that's part of the game. But I think that 99% is also really important. And one of the things you mentioned that's in that 99% is enjoying what you're doing and loving what you're doing and having that connection to what it feels like to ride your bike and go a little bit faster and have that be fun. And I think that is something I've really come back to in the kind of recent year of my career, and thought about a lot is like, how do I understand the role of the 1% and maintain them where it's important, but also get back to that 99% that was there from the very beginning of my career.
Yeah. So I feel like that's a really good start to all of this, like why we started is always kind of couched in like, yeah, but it's fun. Like I want to be doing this, and like, oh, a goal is beginning to sort of emerge. And I think in this next step, you start to pick up sponsors, you start to develop your career, you start to have to worry about more maybe than just having fun, but like, oh, wait a minute, I need to start adopting some other practices to sort of round out the business of Kate. And when I first came across you, I think you had 40,000 followers on Instagram, which is not especially in that era was like a big accomplishment on its own. And you had been just recently signed by Specialized. You were racing in the junior category at that time. And I think maybe the next book that I want to kind of lean into is this book, which I think we both collectively discovered around this same era. Also, another Ryan Holiday favorite, The Obstacle is the Way. I'd love to kind of get your take on this next phase, because you went from having fun, racing NICA events in high school and in college, and kind of getting the ball rolling with your career as a mountain biker. But then there must have been some inflection point where it was like, oh, wait, it's going to get serious. People are starting to come to me with offers. I'm racing now in the bigger events. I'm starting to kind of break through. And, it's not as easy as it sounds, right? The obstacle is the way. I think one of the more important things is like understanding what you can control and what you can't control. And I think when you start moving up beyond this is what I do for fun, you start kind of running into more obstacles and having to really take the right steps forward, right? Can you talk a little bit just about what that experience was like, that inflection point of going from I'm having fun to, oh, I have a career?
Yeah, I think that happened for me slowly and then kind of all at once is what it feels like. And I don't know if it just feels like that in hindsight, but I really, as I said, I was taking things kind of step by step. It was a bit of a blessing and a curse that there was a big age gap to kind of the next best American that I looked up to was Leah Davison. And she was 10 years older than me, and she was racing pro full time. And that felt like too big of a step. I didn't see necessarily a path to get there. I kind of saw like, wow, that would be cool, but I don't know what that looks like today, tomorrow, and the next day. I know what maybe that could look like in 10 years. And so I graduated high school, signed my first pro contract. And at that time, I get asked now, like, oh, did you consider not going to college and racing pro? Like, well, my first contract was for $0. So that was not really, it was for bonus only incentives up to $10,000 was my first pro contract. So I was pretty focused on school, I would say, at that time. It was nice lunch money, but it was not gonna pay rent. So I was a full time student at Stanford at that time, and racing in the U-23 category. And I think because of that, it kind of delayed that pressure feeling. Like I kind of had this grace period where I was being given the tools and being invested in as a young athlete to develop, to race World Cups, to start to stack year over year of training. But I also had this great distraction of being a full time student. And that certainly kept my plate very full. And that, I would say, felt more like my job at the time, was to be a student. And I would say the inflection point was really my junior year. And that was my third year, U-23. And I started to get on European podiums, which was kind of a big step for me. And that was also the year that I signed with Red Bull. And I would say, like, it's easy to see what happened the next year because I had quite a breakout season and was on the top of a lot of podiums and in media, and it was kind of an obvious year of success. But I would say, like, just before that, there was all of this kind of accumulating work. I was eighth in the World Cup overall my first year, U-23. I was fourth my second year. I was second my third year. So it's just really steadily kind of making these strides year over year. And I would say when I was second and I got signed to Red Bull, that was kind of the year that I was like, oh, wow, if I can really have a good last year U-23, it's my last year in college, it's my last year in this category, I might be able to set myself up to be a full-time bike racer when I graduate. And that was kind of the first time that it became more of a real possibility.
That's fascinating because that's not what I would have thought. As the person that signed the other side of the contract, I just figured you were already in it at that point and already, yeah, this is happening, and I just got to finish school, get it out of the way so I can go, race in the Olympics. That was sort of what I thought on my side of it. What was your thought process for the sponsors that you were working with at that point? I mean, how did you interact with it from a business standpoint? Did it feel like more pressure getting that first Red Bull helmet, or how did you feel?
Yeah, I think it felt like opportunity, and I do think that for me it was like I knocked on the door and the door opened, and I absolutely had the aspiration of making it to Olympics and being a full-time athlete, but I think it took time for those possibilities to be tangible. Like, what would that actually look like? It's easy to say that when you're 15, but like, what does that actually look like to have your life structured in a way that supports racing a full-time World Cup calendar in Europe, that supports paying your bills, being able to be a functioning person, and also like pursue these really big goals in a way that's sustainable, and really motivating. And I think the signing with Red Bull and being on the Specialized Factory team, like those two things together started to give me the feeling of like, this is a really big opportunity, and I need to walk through the door. Like, I knocked, the door opened, it's time to walk through. And at that time, the business side honestly was pretty simple. I think, I had these bigger partnerships and sponsors. I was on a factory team, so they take care of your equipment, your travel, a lot of the logistics of being an athlete. And then I also was very lucky, early on. My mom was an employment lawyer, so she did my contracts from a really young age and kind of helped. They weren't overly complicated, but you needed someone to look at them. And she really helped me be strategic about that and understand, okay, what is a contract? What is promised to me, and what am I doing in exchange for this contract? And just starting to understand that relationship with sponsors from a young age, I do think really helped me. And as those partnerships began to grow, I was able to then move on to having an agent and having some bigger partnerships and more official relationships with brands.
What's interesting is that you haven't really talked about any of the content stuff that you did leading into that or surrounding it. And if you really back it up and think about it for a second, you were doing sort of the athlete content thing almost before any other athlete had really taken advantage of it. I mean, you've been building your Instagram account, which is now over 500,000 followers. You'd been building that from the early days. even before that was a requirement, or deliverables were even a thing. And in fact, I think deliverables really never even came into the picture until probably about 2020, and mostly because brands needed content and they couldn't go to the athletes and make the content. And truthfully, that's one of the big reasons why I kind of started looking for the exits on my departure, was that I had been working towards helping athletes and bringing value to athletes. And then when things changed on the deliverables, I was like, ooh, now I have to just call in favor after favor after favor. Like, can you make this content? Can you make this content and send it to me? And that just felt, I don't know. But now it's like a thing where the expectation is. So I was talking to somebody the other day, like, well, how do you know when enough sponsors are enough? And they're like, well, usually every sponsor equals like 20 deliverables. So what's your capacity for delivering Instagram clips or photos or videos or stuff like that? That's your limit, basically.
Yeah. I've thought so much about this, and I would say that my relationship with content and with media and storytelling has evolved many times in my career. I would say early on, part of why I didn't mention it as part of the story is that I think it was really natural for me. I really like telling the stories of what I experience trying to get better at bike racing. And I think I've loved sharing what I love about the sport, whether it's like just a picture of my bike out on a beautiful ride, whether it's like a selfie riding in the rain. Like these things are, I don't have to create them because I'm actually out doing that thing. And there's an easy way to tell the story around it. And I like sharing that. And I think I found early on that it connected me with other people who love what I love. And that immediately made me want to do more of it. And so I think it was always this pretty authentic storytelling piece that then grew into, yeah, telling stories with brands. And I think that 2020 period for me was really difficult. It was around the time that I was preparing for my first Olympics in Tokyo. It was obviously we had COVID, and I had a lot of media requirements at that time. I was kind of going through the US Olympic buildup, which means you like sign on to a bunch of brands, you have big commercials, you have really specific deliverables, and not necessarily the most authentic deliverables, right? They really are creating content. It's not just, integrating content from your life.
Right.
And that felt really different. And I would say it was like a really challenging period for me where I felt I wasn't sure what role it should play in my career. And I think it was also this rise of influencer marketing, and a lot of athletes who were good at media or who enjoyed it or spent a lot of time with it got kind of lumped into this like influencer category. And we are in some ways, but we aren't in other ways. Like my primary job is not to create Instagram content. My primary job is to try to be the best mountain biker in the world. That's my primary job. I tell the story of trying to be the best mountain biker in the world through content. And so I think my thinking evolved around that time to see social media as secondary work. And for me, it was really important to start separating out primary work and secondary work. I would say that my bike racing is primary work. I reflect that story through secondary work on Instagram. Actually, in this latest chapter of my career and business, my relationships with brands is primary work. And the way that we structure our partnerships reflects that. So, for example, you said, a brand might have 20 deliverables. For me, every single partner that I have, every single logo you see on my jersey, I meet directly with their marketing team. I've had a conversation with their CEO, and we align in a way that's bigger than just using the product. And when I enter into that partnership, there have to be at least 3 or 4 ideas of something awesome we could do together that then could be reflected in content. Whether it's developing a product that would really help me as an athlete, whether it's creating an event or an experience around getting more women into the sport, whether it's promoting something we both really care about, like that becomes the primary work. And then we get to take awesome pictures and videos of it and share that story with you. So I don't know if that was a lot of information on my content strategy, but I think it's something that is worth thinking really deeply about to make sure that you have a good strategy that both accomplishes your professional goals, but also kind of like maintains your authenticity and your ability to communicate something real and authentic through everything you put out.
It's interesting the parallel between how you started having fun on bikes and with Instagram and how it felt true to you no matter what. Like, I'm doing this because I like this. I like sharing this kind of stuff, to then having to sort of professionalize it in a way where you have it as a bucket. Like, this was a secondary work and now it exists here. I think you're right. Like, the content and the brand relationship are two separate things as well. And if you can find the right partners that align with you so perfectly, then that makes everything easier. You're developing, if you're working with a bike company and they're working on a bike that fits really well for World Cup racing, then you're all aligned on the same mission. And yeah, the output from it is not just the results, but also the content and the story that you can tell along the way, which makes it really interesting. And what a great position to sort of be in. What
That's so interesting. I hadn't thought about like the arc of those two things as being related, but they absolutely are. And it reminds me, I listened to, it was back when the podcast was The Growth Equation with Steve Magnus and Brad Solberg. And they had an episode with a really famous running coach. I forget who it was, but I remember the message of the podcast, which was they talked about like early in your career, you have these fundamentals. You kind of all you know is what you've learned, which is a pretty simple set of things. And over time, you explore and you add things in and you add things in and you try, you're doing cold plunges and now you're doing mobility and you add in all these little details until it becomes way too much. And then you start removing things. And somehow at the end, like when you have these really, really experienced coaches, they're back to the fundamentals, but with like a very nuanced appreciation of why each thing matters and of why they're doing the set of very simple things that they're doing and not all this other stuff. And I feel as an athlete, I'm kind of going through a similar arc in my career where you have to try things on and you have to be open to new information. You have to be open to learning and evolving. But also at a certain point, you start to take things away and get back to those critical pieces that probably most of which were there in the beginning, but now you understand with so much more depth.
Yeah, absolute refinement at this stage. Just doing the little things perfect and then yeah, kind of getting back to it from there. I like it. I like it. That's cool. I like the idea of I've been thinking a lot about this concept of like breaking out of the cycle of like we get stuck in this execution all the time. Just get this done, then do this, then do this, and using strategy as a way to kind of pull out of the executional stuff and really take a step back and look at what are the things that are actually delivering for me? Am I actually being effective here, or am I just going around in circles trying to do this executional stuff? What can I get rid of, or what can I pass on that I don't need to actually be spending my time in so that I can be more efficient with my time, so I can get better results, so that I can actually grow, not just keep doing the thing that kind of got me here. We talk about like what got you here won't get you there. And I think that the thing that's sort of helping me break out of that is a little bit more focus on the strategy behind it as opposed to just doubling down on execution. I feel like that refinement kind of makes a lot of sense to me in the moment. We strayed away a little bit from the obstacles away, but I think this is a good turn. But I mean, what were those challenges? Because I feel like this moment of like I'm graduating college, I'm getting real sponsors, I'm starting to race, I'm about to become world champion. Like that wasn't as simple. And I think like you and I have talked about this in the past, like, oh yeah, I did this and then I did this, but like there was a trough in between of like constant challenge and struggle. What were the things that you were trying to overcome, the obstacles that you felt like were the way during that specific part?
Absolutely. I think the biggest obstacle at that time was just managing having two focuses, having school and racing. And there were so many little things that came up as a result of that. Even just like having 2 hours for an hour and 40-minute ride and you get a flat and you're late to class, and just that constant stress load for me at a time when I was just learning to manage it was really, really hard. And I think I started to see at that time that those challenges were also opportunities to kind of expand my capacity, whether it was the ability to expand my capacity for just having things on my plate, or my capacity for stress, or my capacity for mental flexibility and adaptability. Like, those obstacles really did provide me with a skill set that would be really, really useful in my life as a professional athlete. And I think Ryan Holiday does a really amazing job. I recommend that book so many, so many times. But does a really amazing job of like walking you through practical examples and ways of thinking about challenges that can kind of flip that mindset. And I think I've gotten better at flipping it more quickly. I think at that age, it would be really stressful and really emotional and really difficult. And then a little bit later, you'd see, oh, I learned a lesson. And I would say with age, one of the things I've worked on is being able to see in the moment, like, oh, this is hard for me because it's a skill that I do not yet have. And it's an opportunity to build that skill. Great. Now it feels a little bit easier. And when you can do that in the moment, you kind of skip this anxiety step. That was a very big step for me at that age.
Well, so after you graduate, I believe, if I'm getting the timeline right, you graduate, so then you have all this extra capacity, then you go win the world championship of mountain biking, first time in 17 years that the rainbow jersey had been in the USA for cross country. Huge moment, big inflection point, and I've got to imagine in your career to have had that happen. Like, obviously it was wild because it was not only like such a big moment for the US audience, but also for you, it was your first year in elite. So you had just shown up on the scene. You took the win. It was like this massive, massive moment for all of us, I think. But
This is pretty special.
what
Yeah.
what was that like, being still so early on in your career, and then having this massive moment just unlocked so quickly?
Yeah, it was pretty incredible, and I think to look back on it, I see even more so what a big moment that was. I think at the time I had been trying so hard for so long to notch a result like that. And, zooming out, it wasn't that long. I was only an elite for that year, but really, I just, throughout the course of that year, I was kind of knocking on the door, and I was top 10 in every World Cup. I was, on in podium position a few times, and then I blow up. And then I was in podium position and I get a flat. Then I was in podium position and something would happen. And so for me, it felt like this thing that I'd been trying to do, and I finally put the pieces together. I think what's crazy about it is that when the pieces came together, it had a much more dramatic outcome than what I had been envisioning at that time. And you really only have that moment once in your career. I think going into Worlds, I always say I had like 3 sets of goals. It was, silver or gold, silver, bronze. Bronze is like, continue to do what you've done. Be top 10. That would be a solid result. You're on the board, and like, it's a race you can be proud of. Silver is, okay, what's a step up? What would feel like an improvement? And that was a top 5, which is what the podium is in an elite World Cup, and that's what I'd been chasing all year, right? And then the shoot for the moon goal was to earn a medal and be top 3 at Worlds. So the shoot for the moon goal was not to win. That was not really, I hadn't excluded that possibility, but it certainly wasn't top of mind. And I think that feeling of thinking you might be able to do something, and then being in the moment and being able to execute all these process goals that you've been working on and working on and working on, and see, okay, it's working. I'm checking this box and I'm in a good spot, and I'm checking this box and I'm in second. I'm checking this box, now I'm fighting for the win. Like, that was a really crazy experience, and to have it, culminate in a result that was beyond my wildest dreams was this like really crazy, just emotional, huge moment, not just for me, but for all of these people that were a part of that journey you included, Lucy,
I
that
cried, by the
that
way.
believed. Well, that believed, and that's the belief that really matters. Is the belief not after the win. I think then you kind of, it feels obvious that you can win because you just did, right? And even if it's still just as hard and just as kind of impossible, it shifts. Like the expectation shifts, and you've now done it once at least. But before you've ever done it, like the people that believe it's possible and invest and invest and invest, um, it's really just a incredible feeling to kind of over deliver for those people.
Yeah, felt pretty great.
Was fun. Would recommend.
What's it like after winning the world championship, though? Because it's such an audacious goal to be number one in the world. You get this special jersey, you get rainbow stripes forever. There's all kinds of accolades. Sponsors are knocking on your door left and right. After you've accomplished such a massive goal, I've heard so many stories of people that kind of like, oh, I've done the thing now. Now what? What was that moment like for you when you realized like the just like I've accomplished it and now what do I do now?
It was really interesting for me because of the way that that race played out and of the period of my career that I was in when I got that result. I think it would be very different if you kind of like flipped my career around and that happened at the end. But because I was 22, I was a first year elite, and I had this kind of what was a bit of a surprise win. First of all, I just enjoyed it. Like I felt no pressure. I felt like I'd like won the lottery, and I got to wear this special fun rainbow jersey and bring it back, and like it had an impact on people, like especially I think young girls in the US. Like it was just so cool to get to share that with them. And I think I as an athlete have always really been driven by the ability to translate these races and these experiences into something that's valuable and inspiring and useful for other people. And so this was like the ultimate expression of that, right? Is I got to bring this jersey around and say, like, an American rider hasn't done this in a long time, and like you can do it too. And here's this jersey and sign poster, and just make it really fun. So I think that was like thing one I had going for me is I didn't feel that pressure because no one expected me to have won in the first place. And then I think thing two is I actually had, and I've recognized this at multiple points in my career, like when there's a little bit of a naysayer um, around my performance, it almost like motivated me more early on when people said, an American hasn't won in a long time. It immediately made me go internally, but I wonder if I could.
Mm.
And I think the same thing happened when I was in the rainbow jersey, where there was a category of people who thought, yeah, but it was a one off and she won't be able to back it up. And so I don't think it was like it was not yet at the point of an expectation. It was kind of this like challenge to me. Oh, I wonder if I can back this up. Like, I'm going to line up this year. And every time that I line up, I'm going to be able to look down and know that at one point, I won a race. At one point, I was fast enough to get this rainbow jersey. So maybe, just maybe, I could do it again. And I think that mindset really fueled me through 2019 and allowed me to kind of make the step up, both physically. I think it was a great kind of time in my evolution as an athlete that I kept kind of layering on these years of competition and training. So I was ready for that jump up in performance. But I actually think it was mostly mental, that I kind of felt like, okay, I don't really care what other people think. I think maybe I could do it, and that's enough.
What was it like being the world champion from a business perspective in that stage? Because you obviously changed bike sponsors at the end of that after you won. And I've got to imagine that like everyone's probably hitting you up and there's probably a lot more no's than yeses in that phase, right? You're number one in the world. You've got this bright long career ahead of you. I mean, to win a world championship your first year in elite, the lifespan of a pro athlete in cross country is pretty long. So not only did you have a big result, but like the expectation was that you were going to be around for a really long time, which for a brand is like kind of the winning combo. It's like they wanted to build out a partnership. From a business point, I mean, you obviously had an agent at that point, but how were you managing just in general during that era?
Yeah, I think having an agent at that point was really, really helpful. And I think there was a lot of kind of continuity in my story because of that. Because I think Jonathan Retzek at RXR Sports, he was my agent for this entire period and still is my agent. So one of the things I really respect about the way that he operates his business is that there is this focus on the long game, and that there's uh, a lot of scrutiny in what types of deals we take on. They have to like make sense, right? And there's something about that that can be really infinitely complicated, but can also be really simple. Of like when you see an athlete sign with the brand and they align, it just makes sense, right? And I really respect the way that Jonathan helped kind of constrain some of those opportunities to the ones that made sense for me at that time, and that could continue to build and grow with me. But it definitely expanded the part of my job that is not bike racing, right? The part of my job that is interviews and media and photo shoots and brands. And I think I was learning to manage a lot of those things at that time.
I've got to imagine that your collegiate experience where you were going to class and trying to race and trying to train probably paid off a lot during that era where you do have all these deliverables and expectations, but you also have to train and race too. Probably really kind of came back and helped you out a second time around, huh?
Honestly, it really did. Like, I think it was still easier than being a full time student. So it didn't feel like that crazy to me. Um, but I do think, like, the pressure and kind of the building, mounting excitement and expectation during that time, like, it was picking up steam. And ultimately, like, that was 2019. The big goal was the Olympics. And I think it was just this, like, full focus, full steam ahead period where really I was just focused on trying to win.
I've got to imagine around here there now we move on to this next book in our book
Next
list,
book.
right? The Second Mountain, which we've talked about this book. You and I think you actually recommended it to me. And The Second Mountain by David Brooks talks about like this world of deeper meaning and fulfillment and really like the idea is that like your first mountain is sort of not in a negative way, but like a self-centered goal. Like I want to accomplish this thing. And then the second mountain is more of a sort of like I want to give this thing. I want to deliver this thing. And a lot of times the valley between those two is sort of like a crisis or a catalyst. And then you have this sort of moment where you're building something that sort of serves others, brings value to other people. And I feel like this kind of matches up with the next era, right? Like First Mountain feels very clear that winning the world championship would be the peak of that mountain. You talk a little bit about what the valley
The
and
valley.
this
And now we are in the valley. Um Certainly. Yeah, and I actually think it's super valuable to talk about that phase of my career. It was really challenging, and I think my perspective on it continues to shift over time as I look back and I see you kind of see the pressures that are in place, and kind of setting the stage for a period that is difficult. And I think for me, that came around that Olympic year through a variety of factors. I see it now, like I pre-qualified for the Olympics in 2019. I won the World Cup overall. I was ranked first in the world, and I did all the Olympic media in kind of fall and winter. And then March comes around and I finally get to start racing. I'm in like the best shape of my life. And we do one race, and like we did a short track and XC was canceled. We all flew home and it was lockdown. And so I really like I stayed in this super intense mindset for that entire year because the Olympics got moved, obviously, and our races got canceled and moved, but they were moved in 6-week increments, really. So I kept on this like level of intensity of like, I'm trying to win the Olympics today for a year. And I didn't touch a start line. And I went from first in the world to 77th in the world rankings because they actually kept racing in Europe and they didn't freeze the points. And so if you're a US athlete, you kind of had two choices. You could wait it out and not race in Europe or at all, or you could fly on a one way ticket and go like race local races in Europe and figure it out. But like not know if you could come home and like not know what the situation was with COVID. So I stayed home and we ended up having two World Cups at the end of that year, kind of in a 1 week October period, but we really didn't have racing. And so then we enter what is, now the real Olympic year in 2021. And I think I just struggled. Like, I think I was already tired and probably overtrained coming into that year. And then I just kept doubling down and really struggled with that year. And I think in hindsight, I actually was doing pretty well at the beginning of the year, but I think the metric in my head was like, I'm supposed to try to win the Olympics. Therefore, today has to go perfectly, right? If today's not going perfectly, how am I supposed to do this impossible thing? Which is exactly the opposite mindset of what I talked about with Worlds, right? Like my first World Championship, it's like, wow, maybe this could go better than I thought, versus it has to go impossibly well, and anything less than that is going to cause a really big problem for me. And that obviously did not work out for me. I had a really tough Tokyo Olympics. I think the rest of that year was kind of like the valley for me, and a period of really reassessing like what I wanted, what I'm excited about with mountain bike racing, like what's working, what's not, what do I need as a person, like as a human being, to like have a bit of a wider aperture on life again for a little bit. And that period kind of lasted for a while. I would say it took another year to kind of get my footing back under me. And then the last couple of years, like 2023, 2024, I've raced solidly, but I haven't gotten back to that kind of like peak performance that I kind of can feel I'm capable of, but haven't been able to access. And I think a lot of that has been related to these bigger shifts of like, what's motivating to me? What type of environment do I need to succeed? Like, what is my relationship with expectation, with success? Like, what is Kate outside of bike racing that I want to bring to bike racing, and kind of separating those aspects of who I am from what I do. And I think a lot of that I would call the valley journey down there, has produced some clarity on what is important to me in this next chapter of my career, and is behind a lot of the changes that I've made this year.
So the second mountain, from the outside, it looks like your second mountain has a lot to do with She Sends, in terms of a goal, in terms of bringing something that, serves others, that really is just like about more than just your own racing, but it truly is like this bigger goal that you have that sort of drives you forward, right? You're building a community, you're getting more girls and women on bikes, and using kind of this next phase to really not only race, but to offer something up to the world that I think you want to see happen. It feels like a really powerful second mountain to be chasing. You want to talk a little bit about She Sends and sort of where it all came from?
Yeah, I'd love to. And it definitely is that kind of second mountain piece. I think for me, it started earlier or I guess last year in 2024. And my contract was up and I had some factory offers, and was really thinking through like what would be the right next step for me. And I kind of couldn't shake this idea that there might be a way to do things differently. And I think for me, this kind of chunk of my career, I have these like zoom out moments. And for athletes in my sport, the Olympics really provide the framework for that. So we kind of operate on a 4-year cycle. A lot of the contracts do. And that's kind of how you think about things in chunks of time. And so, I changed coaches in 2024. Was it mid 2023? So like end of 2023, I changed coaches. And at that time, I wasn't sure how much longer I was going to race. Things were like pretty tough, and I was not making a lot of progress. And I didn't necessarily see a path to getting what I wanted out of the sport, not just in terms of results, but I was really at this like crux moment, and I ended up hiring a new coach, Barry Austin, and he said, "I'll coach you, but you have to race till LA 28." It's a long term project, right? I think he wanted to have this like bigger long term focus to really like build back up, and do some things differently in my performance and have it be this like longer term goal versus the type of, okay, I'm going to change coaches, see if I win next year and then retire. So I committed to this LA 28 chunk, and I knew I was going to race this period. And as I started to think about structuring my team for that, I just couldn't get away from the desire to really connect my high performance goals with what I see as this kind of like purpose driven piece of my career. So She Sends Foundation I launched also in 2023. And the mission is to connect, support, and inspire women and girls through mountain biking. So most of our work is funding grants to really amazing grassroots programs that are getting more girls on bikes and creating more opportunity for women in the sport. So, I'm having this parallel experience of trying to find, my footing in my professional career, and also, having this like gratifying experience with, helping the next generation in the sport. And I thought about like putting those two things together. And I think for me, doing my own program, so I'll be racing for She Sends this year, which is really to represent the foundation and promote its message and call attention and funding to that mission. It's a big leap and step and kind of risk for me, and I thought about it for a long time, like whether I really wanted to take that on. And ultimately it came down to that authenticity piece and like living your values. And I go ride with these young girls and women on bikes, and I tell them like, send it, go big, go after your dreams, and take risk and be willing to like try something. And I knew that if that was really at the heart of this kind of purpose for me, like I needed to be willing to do that too. So putting those two things together has kind of brought a new element to my racing and also to the business structure of how I do things.
Well, you can definitely tie it back again to your college experience. I can see these patterns emerging. I don't know. Maybe you probably see it too, but yeah, you were able to do two things at the same time in college and racing. Then you were able to do it as a world champion with the deliverables and racing. And now here you are, running your own program and racing. I mean, it feels very congruent to the rest of your life. Everything that you've done, you've been capable, and you've told yourself that story. Of course, I can do both these things. Of course, I can, represent my own thing. I think, like from a mountain bike standpoint specifically, and maybe across even more sports than that, the ability to, of course, this concept of like privateering has existed forever, but I think like racing for your own team that you represent, that represents a cause, a meaning, a foundation, the sort of in what's the right word to use here, but just sort of the intention to do that, I think is really interesting, that I think a lot of other athletes will likely take inspiration from. You're probably one of the first to do exactly that, where you say like, this is my foundation, I'm representing this. All of the goodwill that comes in and all the visibility that comes in from my racing is going to go to this very important cause that I care about. I want more girls and women on bikes and get them excited about it and into it. And I'm going to really double down on that, which I think everyone else has kind of gone like, well, what sponsor do I put on my shirt? And then what other sponsors do I put around those? You've gone such a different way that I think inspires a lot of people to kind of test it out. But I'm sure it's
Thank you.
not without some challenges, some struggles,
Yeah.
some
I was going to say, yeah, I do think, for me, that's the only way I would have been willing to do it, is with this kind of mission driven piece, because to be honest, it is a lot of work. And I think our current climate of high performance, we talked about it at the beginning, this like focus on 1%. Anything that I do that's not making me better at bike racing is making me worse at bike racing. Like that is a mentality that I think has grown in popularity in the last decade. And this feeling of like high performance athletes need to sacrifice everything and be super narrow, and we'd all be better if we like lived in a tiny cabin at altitude and didn't talk to anyone and only ate rice. And I just don't think that that's true. And I also think it's true in different ways for different people. And so for me, what I'm learning is like, I actually have always done better when I have a positive outlet and positive distraction alongside racing. It was school for me in my early 20s. And now, like, this kind of team, business management, sponsor relations, foundation, like this side of it fills that cup for me. And what I've seen so far, and I really respect and appreciate my coach for kind of seeing this in me before I did, is that when I have these things in balance, and it takes work to keep them balanced, they fuel each other. I'm more focused on the bike. I'm more excited to race. I'm more free to race. And then also, I like have these fulfilling, exciting things that keep me motivated off the bike so that I can kind of like let these things play off each other and fuel each
That's
other.
so cool to think about how that might also evolve you beyond, just racing and everything. Like, what does it look like in 5 or 10 years when there's a full fleet of racers on Shisens that are all representing the cause, that are all helping you? Because you've had to do a lot of heavy lifting for, the foundation. And of course, you've had help along the way, but you've done a lot. And thinking about what it might look like to have more than just you representing She Sends, and the acumen that you're building over your career, and doubly so now that you're really taking control of the team itself, could really turn into something even more interesting down the line. So it's kind of fun to watch the evolution as it continues to occur.
Thank you. I have another book that might be. Did you have another book?
I had I
Did I?
had two more, but one of the ones.
Oh
No,
no.
no, all good, all good, all good. What I think, there's one book that you also recommended to me that was The Art of Possibility. And I was thinking about that one in the context of how when you showed up at World Champs, you weren't necessarily going to like win as your A goal. And there's a thing in there where there was a teacher who encouraged their students to start the semester with an A and then live up to it rather than be afraid of failure. And I think that's really interesting in all these different phases, including She Sends. Like, you are, setting your intention out there. You have this like amazing goal that you're all fired up for, and you're delivering on it right out of the gate. And now you get a chance to kind of live up to it this season, and as you grow forward. I think that's a really interesting thing. And the other thing from that book was you can leadership isn't about authority, it's about inspiring others. And I think, again, like thinking about how She Sends will not just inspire people to get on bikes, but also inspire people to think differently about how they structure their teams, how they structure their effort and energy that goes into these things, their intention when it comes to sponsorships and building out programs. I just feel like there's something just different about what you're doing that I really super respect. What
Thank
book you
you.
got?
I really appreciate that. And no, I was going to say back to the art of possibility. I also all the books you talked about were like literally on my bedside table. So I have them here. They're like all here. But the giving yourself an A piece, one of the things I found really interesting about the way that they spoke about that, and it was a professor was talking about starting the year, and he had students write a letter to themselves as, if I get an A, this is what it would look like. Like, I would earn an A by doing X, Y, and Z. And I found that really interesting because it created a more nuanced picture of not just what success would look like on paper, but what it would feel like. Like, what would it feel like to have success, to have an A? Like, what does embodying an A look like? And I do think I've had a little bit of that kind of exercise in my career in this period of time where it's like, what does getting to 2028 look like? And for sure, there's some outcome goals that would be really exciting to reach for in that year. But that alone would not be an A. Like, an A is all of these kind of more qualitative things of like taking risk, giving everything, having an impact, inspiring others. Like, those things matter too. And I think having that like more complete, holistic, textured version of like, what does my most successful self look like in this time period can help you accomplish that along the way.
Well, you've already high-fived Tom Cruise at the Hollywood signs, so
It's a good
your
start.
LA Olympic experience is off to a pretty darn good. Yeah, that was incredible, by the way. Um, yeah, I mean, we're gonna have to get back together at the end of the season and sort of recap because I feel like what you've got on deck is really interesting, and the sponsorship announcements that just came out and everything else that's kind of rolling out. And obviously, you got your first win under your belt from South Africa, so that's got to feel pretty good. First race in the New Jersey and a first W, like pretty good start to the season. But I feel like you're gonna have all kinds of lessons that you're gonna pick up this year on and off the race course, and I think it'll be really interesting to kind of check back in and see like how did it go? What did you learn? What were the obstacles in the way, and what were the lessons that you brought back from it? Because I think that's the benefit of, kind of going out on your own like this, is that you get a chance to have a front row seat to all the roller coasters that kind of come, the good and the bad, with all this stuff, and then you get to reapply it the following year and continue to build with it. So
We'll definitely have to do a recap. I'm sure I'll have some stories at the end of the year.
well, we usually end this pod with a segment called BPC, which is brand product content. So because you're the guest, I'm going to give you the first shot.
Well, now I'm stuck because I thought of a book that I would talk about, but I'll share my original piece of
Okay.
content. One of my partners this year is Rafa, and they do an amazing job with storytelling. I think the way that they kind of like tell stories through their athletes, and they're often very athlete driven, is something that's been really inspiring to me. And they just released a new film with Lachlan Morton that is on. It's called like In a Day, and it's on a 650-kilometer ride from Auckland to Wellington, chasing this super old record. And so it was someone who set the record a pretty long time ago on like down tube shifting bikes, and it was super fast. And so Lachlan goes out and like tries to take that record. And I think it's on YouTube. It was really good.
That's amazing. I'm definitely going to check that one out. Big fan of Lachlan, and I love his approach as like obviously he's capable as a racer, but this whole like project based thing, which obviously you've dealt with enough at Red Bull, but the idea of athletes going out and doing projects, I think, is so clever, and when you can do it right, it's something special, you know?
Yeah, and it's like cycling is this unique sport because we can relate to a wider audience. I think like not everyone has done cliff diving or driven a race car, but like most people have ridden a bike, like to work or around or even on the weekends. And so an idea like, I wonder if I could ride from Auckland to Wellington in a day. Like there's something about it that just is so pure, and it's at the heart of what draws us all into the sport of like, I wonder if I could go that far or do it faster or beat my buddy on that segment. And yeah, to me, I think it's important to keep track of the fact that like we are all having a very similar experience, just at slightly different
Yeah,
levels.
yeah, that's perfect. Okay, I'm going a completely opposite direction. It is a book, but the one thing is, like, we've talked a lot about books that have given us good insight, and there's lots of business books that we reference on this podcast all the time. And there's a Derek Sivers quote that goes like, "If information was the solution, we'd all be billionaires with perfect abs." And I think that a lot of times too, like you and I trade a lot of really good, insightful books, and we read a lot. And one of the things that I'm starting to kind of rotate into my reading list is a little bit of fiction, because I think sometimes it starts to get monotonous. We're like, oh, I've heard this piece of advice, or oh, there's a version of that that's out there, or whatever. And so my friend Jeremy gave me this book called Dungeon Crawler Carl, and it's a really nice fresh breath of fresh air. And the basic premise is that aliens come to Earth and basically wipe out most of the people, and the remaining people that survived get forced into dungeons and have to make their way through the dungeons. And it's a game show that the rest of the universe is watching these people try to survive. And it's just fun, and it's just like a nice like palate cleanser for all the other stuff that I'm reading that maybe is a little bit more serious. It's kind of nice to have a book that is like,
I
you
love
know,
that. Yeah,
so
sometimes it's just good to read a
yeah,
book.
yeah, yeah. Keeps the momentum up a little bit too.
Yeah,
You're just,
keep some
I don't know.
momentum.
I
Yeah,
need more of a break these days than I used to, and a
I
good
love that.
fiction book that's like a quick read that you can't really put down. Just kind of, I don't know, keeps the stoke high, and
It's a spice of
that's where I'm
life.
at.
I love that. Okay, I gotta check that out.
Okay, thank you so much for being on the pod. We're definitely got to get a recap pod on the books for the end of the season, but all the best for this year. We're all cheering you on, and so exciting just to see the evolution. And yeah, can't wait to see where it all goes.
Thanks for being a part of it.